What would you do if you were sentenced to 60 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit? Imagine being locked away, knowing you're innocent, but no one believes you. How far would you go to prove your innocence? Victor Hayes spent years fighting for his freedom. But what happens when the truth finally comes to light? Stay tuned to discover the shocking twist. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more incredible stories. Victor Hayes was just another young man trying to get by in the gritty streets of Chicago. The city had its share of violence, with news of shootings and gang activity often dominating the headlines. But Victor never thought he would become a part of that story. At 25, he was an ordinary guy, working at a local warehouse, living in a modest apartment and trying to stay out of trouble. He'd always kept to himself, quietly navigating through a city where danger lurked just around the corner. But one fateful night, everything changed. The evening of the shooting, 2 people were killed, and 5 others were left injured in what seemed like a random act of violence at a crowded bar in the heart of the city. The shooter, a man wearing a hoodie and a mask, fled the scene, leaving chaos and panic behind. There was no clear evidence, no solid leads, until the police arrested Victor. It wasn't the evidence that pointed to him. It wasn't the fact that his fingerprints were found at the scene or that his DNA matched. It was simply the fact that he looked like the man on the grainy surveillance footage. The police had acted on a vague description, a tall man with a similar build and similar features. Victor, who had no alibi and was in the wrong place at the wrong time, fit that description perfectly. As Victor sat in the courtroom, awaiting his fate, the air felt thick with tension. The whispers from the crowd were barely audible, but they pierced through him like daggers. Every pair of eyes in the room felt like they were judging him, condemning him before he had even spoken. Victor didn't just feel like he was on trial for a crime he didn't commit. It felt as if the entire world had already decided he was guilty. The trial of Victor Hayes unfolded like a nightmare he couldn't escape. As the day wore on in the courthouse, it became clear that the system was pushing forward with an agenda that didn't care about the truth. Victor was accused of a mass shooting that had rocked the city, leaving 2 dead and 5 wounded. Yet, the evidence against him was flimsy at best. A blurry video from a security camera showed a figure with a similar build to Victor, but the video quality was so poor that it was impossible to make out any clear features. Victor wasn't even in the footage for more than a few seconds, but it was enough to connect him to the crime in the minds of the authorities. What really sealed his fate was the eyewitness testimony. An elderly man, shaking in the witness stand, identified Victor as the shooter. The man's voice cracked as he pointed to Victor in the courtroom, his words barely audible. "That's him. That's the man I saw." The hesitation in the man's voice didn't stop the prosecutor from pushing forward with the case. The man had simply seen someone who looked like Victor, nothing more, nothing less. Yet that was enough for the police to arrest Victor and for the jury to start drawing conclusions. As the trial progressed, Victor's family sat behind him in the courtroom, their faces filled with disbelief and grief. Victor's mother, a kind woman in her late 50s, couldn't hold back her tears. She had raised Victor to be honest, hardworking, and humble, and yet here he was, accused of something so horrible. She sobbed quietly, clutching her handkerchief, her heart breaking with every word spoken by the prosecutor. She couldn't understand how they could take her son away from her, based on nothing but a mere resemblance and a blurry video. She couldn't comprehend how the system was failing him in such a crucial moment. Beside her, Tina, Victor's sister, sat frozen. She was struggling to hold it together, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. Tina had always been protective of Victor. She'd watched over him as children, and now, Watching him being torn apart by the courtroom drama felt like an assault on everything she knew. She knew her brother better than anyone. He was kind, not capable of violence. Yet here they were, facing accusations that couldn't be further from the truth. On the other side, Victor's defense attorney, a man named James Carter, seemed like he was just going through the motions. He had been assigned to the case, and it was clear he didn't have the resources or time to truly prepare. His movements were slow, and his questions were unconvincing. He barely looked at Victor during the trial, focused instead on shuffling through his pile of cases. It was a far cry from the kind of defense Victor needed. The system, in all its efficiency, had completely failed him. There was no one on his side, no one who was willing to fight for the truth. Victor felt the weight of his situation crush him more with each passing minute. In the courtroom, all the noise faded into the background as Victor sat there, helpless. He knew he was innocent, but no one seemed to care. The case was progressing, and his life was hanging by a thread, driven by flawed testimonies and evidence that was anything but solid. The truth didn't seem to matter. After Victor Hayes was sentenced, the harsh reality of prison life hit him like a tidal wave. The prison was cold, overcrowded, and oppressive. From the moment he stepped inside, the world he once knew seemed like a distant memory. He was stripped of his identity, reduced to just another number in the system, and shoved into an environment where survival was the only goal. The sense of freedom he once took for granted was gone, replaced by walls that loomed over him like a constant reminder of his unjust fate. The first few days were the toughest. Victor shared a small, cramped cell with a man who barely spoke, but whose eyes were filled with judgment. The prison was a constant barrage of noise, shouted orders, clanging metal doors, and the unsettling sounds of distant cries and footsteps echoing in the hallways. The guards, indifferent to his plight, barely gave him a second glance as they processed him. They treated him the same as everyone else, assuming he was guilty without ever questioning the legitimacy of the trial that had sent him here. It was a world where innocence didn't matter, only survival did. The other inmates viewed him with suspicion. Victor didn't belong in their world, and they made sure he knew it. In the cafeteria, in the hallways, in the yard, he could feel the cold, judging stares on his back. It didn't matter that he had been wrongfully convicted. He was just another man in an orange jumpsuit. One afternoon, in the prison yard, a group of men surrounded him. They were bigger, older, and rougher than Victor, and they didn't care about his innocence. "You look like you don't belong here," one man sneered before landing the first punch. Victor hit the ground hard, tasting dirt and blood as fists rained down on him from every direction. His body ached, but what hurt more than the physical pain was the reality that this was now his life. Beaten, bruised, and left on the cold ground, Victor felt the weight of his situation press down on him, like a heavy chain around his chest. The guards didn't intervene until after the fight was over, leaving Victor to fend for himself. No one cared. No one was fighting for him. They just saw a man who didn't belong, a man who had been condemned to the same fate as the other criminals in the yard. The physical pain from the attack was nothing compared to the emotional toll. Every bruise, every cut was a reminder of how the world saw him, not as an innocent man fighting for justice, but as just another criminal. The isolation was suffocating. Victor kept to himself, avoiding any further altercations, but the psychological pressure was mounting. He spent hours alone in his cell, his mind racing with doubt. What if he would never get out? What if he was going to rot here, paying for a crime he didn't commit? His mind spiraled with thoughts of hopelessness. But through it all, he fought to hold onto his belief in his innocence. The days were long and the nights even longer. In the silence of his cell, when the rest of the prison slept, Victor would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his family, his mother and sister, and the life he had once known. It felt so far away now, like a distant dream he was struggling to remember. The pain of being separated from them was unbearable, but the hope that one day the truth would come to light kept him going. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the pressure of his situation began to feel unbearable. The once quiet, solitary moments of his prison life now felt like an eternity. His physical surroundings weren't the only things that were deteriorating. The emotional strain, the never-ending mental exhaustion, was beginning to take its toll on Victor. Every day in prison felt like another piece of himself was slipping away. The hopelessness weighed him down, but he refused to let it consume him entirely. He wasn't just fighting to survive physically, he was fighting to maintain his sanity. The emotional toll of being wrongfully convicted was taking its toll on his mind. But he clung to the one thing that hadn't been taken from him, the truth. Victor was innocent, and he had to believe that someday, someone would find a way to prove it. It was the only thing keeping him from breaking under the weight of the system. But as each day passed, the mental strain became harder to endure. Would anyone ever hear his side of the story, or would he remain another nameless face in the system, forgotten and ignored? The uncertainty of it all was the hardest part to bear. One quiet afternoon, Victor Hayes received unexpected news, a letter addressed to Judge Peter Williams, the very man who had sentenced him. The letter, sent by a state investigator, contained a revelation that would change everything. Trevor Marsh, a notorious career criminal, was the real shooter. The letter detailed Marsh's confession, made during questioning for an unrelated crime. Marsh admitted to being the one who had entered the bar that night, fired the shots, and left 2 people dead and 5 injured. Trevor Marsh had a long criminal history, filled with armed robberies, assaults, and other violent offenses. But the shooting that Victor had been wrongfully convicted for was far more reckless. Marsh had concealed his face with a mask, but his build and height were strikingly similar to Victor's, which led to the mistaken eyewitness identification. The authorities had never bothered to dig deeper into the confession, and instead, they let the evidence slip through the cracks, allowing Victor to take the fall for a crime he didn't commit. When Judge Williams read the letter, he felt a wave of disbelief and guilt crash over him. He had sentenced Victor based on weak evidence, nothing more than a blurry video and a faulty eyewitness identification. There was no connection between Victor and the crime scene, and no physical evidence to tie him to the shooting. Victor was a victim of pure misfortune, simply having a similar appearance to the real shooter. But the confession from Marsh, buried in the system for so long, had never been brought to light until now. The letter explained how Marsh had been arrested on an unrelated charge, and during his questioning, he had casually confessed to committing the shooting. The authorities, however, had ignored the confession, allowing it to be buried in a stack of paperwork that no one had bothered to investigate further. Meanwhile, Victor remained locked in prison, paying for a crime he had not committed. Judge Williams was shaken to his core. He had been part of a system that had failed Victor and countless others. He had made a rushed decision, sentencing an innocent man without looking closely at the facts. He had believed in the system, in the justice it was supposed to deliver, but this case had shattered that belief. How many others had been wrongfully convicted because of flawed evidence, mistaken identities, and lack of thorough investigation? The realization hit hard. Despite this newfound evidence, Victor's road to freedom would not be easy. The confession would need to be verified, and legal hurdles would need to be overcome. The authorities would be reluctant to reopen a case that had been closed for so long. But for the first time, Victor had hope. The truth had finally come to light, and now the battle to clear his name and bring justice to the situation had begun. It wasn't just about proving Victor's innocence anymore. It was about making the system answer for the lives it had damaged. Judge Williams, burdened by the weight of his own role in this miscarriage of justice, knew the path forward would be difficult, but he was determined to make it right. The truth could no longer be ignored, and Victor was no longer just another prisoner. He was a man fighting for his life, and his freedom was now within reach. After reading the investigator's letter, Judge Peter Williams could no longer ignore the truth. The confession from Trevor Marsh was undeniable proof that Victor Hayes had been wrongfully convicted. Judge Williams, burdened by the gravity of the mistake, made the decision to reopen the case. It wasn't an easy choice. No one likes to admit that they have made a serious error, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The decision to reopen the case set off a chain of legal processes that took time. Victor's defense team, now armed with the new evidence, petitioned for his release. The legal battle wasn't quick, and there were many hurdles to overcome. The state was reluctant to admit the injustice, but as the evidence mounted, the truth became harder to ignore. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, the decision was made. Victor Hayes was released from prison. The wrongful conviction that had cost him years of his life was overturned. When Victor walked out of the prison gates, he was greeted by his family who had fought tirelessly for his freedom. His mother, her face etched with both exhaustion and relief, threw her arms around him. Tina, his sister, held him tightly, whispering over and over, "You're free. You're finally free." The weight of the years lost, of the moments stolen, settled over Victor like a heavy fog. Though his heart was filled with relief, there was an undeniable emptiness. The years spent behind bars had taken a toll on him, and the journey to reclaim those years was impossible. Victor stood there, surrounded by the people he loved, but the celebration was bittersweet. The joy of his release was overshadowed by the pain of the years lost. His mother's embrace was warm, but the gap between them was wider than it had ever been. His sister, though happy, couldn't mask the years of anger and frustration that had built up during his wrongful incarceration. The people he loved had suffered alongside him, and no amount of time would bring back what had been stolen. Judge Williams watched the release from his chambers, his thoughts heavy. He had played a part in ruining Victor's life, no matter how unintentional. He had trusted the system that had failed him, that had failed Victor. As he looked at Victor's family, he couldn't escape the deep sense of guilt that lingered. He had sentenced an innocent man to prison, believing that justice had been served. But the more he reflected on the case, the more he realized how deeply flawed the system was. He had been blinded by the conviction of his role, not questioning the weight of his decisions. The truth was clear now, and while Victor's freedom had been restored, the stain of the wrongful conviction would forever remain on the fabric of the justice system. Judge Williams had made a grave error, and he knew he could never undo the damage done to Victor, no matter how hard he tried. The injustice was a scar on his career, one that would leave him forever questioning the integrity of the system he had spent years upholding. As Victor left the courthouse, the applause from supporters didn't feel like victory. It felt like a moment of reckoning. There was relief, yes, but the road to true justice was far from over. Victor had been given his freedom, but the fight for a fair system would continue, and it was up to the world to decide whether this was a single victory or the start of something greater. This story sheds light on the serious flaws within the justice system. It serves as a stark reminder that innocent people are sometimes wrongfully convicted due to mistakes in evidence, biases, or rushed decisions. Victor Hayes was a victim of a system that prioritized efficiency over truth, leading to his wrongful conviction. His case illustrates the dangers of failing to thoroughly investigate before rushing to judgment. The story also highlights the profound consequences of such mistakes. While errors are inevitable, they must be corrected when discovered. Victor's life was irreparably altered by a conviction that should never have happened, yet it was only through determination and the revelation of new evidence that his freedom was restored. The justice system must be held accountable for its failures, as innocent lives should not be sacrificed for the sake of expediency. Victor's story also teaches us about hope and redemption. Despite the overwhelming odds and the unjust path he was forced down, Victor never gave up on the fight for justice. His case demonstrates that justice isn't solely about punishment. It's about making sure the right person is held accountable. Victor's journey was long, but it serves as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of seeking truth, no matter the cost.